Welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 4. I'm Bob Judson. I'm the host for this podcast, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. Whether you're a new joiner or a seasoned listener, then I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that we provide. The personal stories, the thematic episodes, and of course, the fantastic guest interviews. If you've been with me since the beginning, then I'm enormously grateful for your loyalty and thank you so much. If you're relatively new to the show, then I really hope you like it, and I hope you find all of it interesting and some of it hopefully useful to you. Please subscribe on whichever channel it is you're using, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast platform. That really helps us boost the show and get it over the hills on the algorithms. So if you can do that for me, I would be enormously grateful. But without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. And welcome to the first Personal Stories episode of Season 4 in 2026. Really great to be back with you. And I thought I'd continue the Personal Stories theme where I left off, really, which is talking about my time as the Assistant Chief of Defence Staff Operations in the Ministry of Defence. So I'm closing on the end of my Air Force career and the kind of all of the big sexy roles that I had doing that. But I think it's important to cover some stuff that I think is going to be of interest to you because it's not that well known. And one of those areas is COBRA, the government emergency machinery. Often talked about, often heard on the news, but what is it? What does it actually do? How does it all work? What's the function? And I thought that would be quite an interesting topic for an episode, not least because it was an area that I found fascinating. It was an area I spent a lot of time in during that role because every time there's some significant issue pops up, COBRA is really the first port of call for government. It's a really significant element of the government's emergency machinery and works really effectively from that point of view. It's a great acronym. It's not quite as sexy as it actually sounds in the first place when you actually go to the facility, because fundamentally it is a facility. It stands for Cabinet Office Briefing Room A and is a physical facility in the Cabinet Office in Whitehall. And when you look at it, it's not much to look at, really. It's a set of briefing rooms with a big room that is the main one where most of the significant events take place. And around the outside of that, a whole series of other smaller rooms. And the way it operates is you can actually have a meeting running with subordinate teams, if you like, sitting in the outside rooms. So very often from a Ministry of Defence perspective, for example, if we had the Chief of Defence Staff in COBRA at a top level one, and I'll come to the levels and discuss that in a second, then we would have a team, which would probably include me or some of my team in the smaller room on the outside, who are able to communicate directly by all sorts of different links into the main room to turn around and feed information if it was required into whoever your principal was at the big table. And so it worked very effectively from that point of view. Obviously, in the main room, it was, as you would expect, pretty swept up in terms of communication systems. So you could have secure video conferencing to pretty much anywhere and telephone conferencing, etc. as well. So it acted as a hub, and really that was the main element of it. But the physical facility perhaps wasn't the important aspect of it. It was about the way it functioned and what it actually did. And there were various levels of COBRAs. I mean, at the top level, and you hear it talked about again on the news quite regularly, the Prime Minister would sit chairing the meeting, and there would usually be cabinet ministers around the table, and or if it's any kind of military involvement, the Chief of Defence Staff would invariably be there. The heads of the agencies would very regularly be there for an intelligence feed, etc. But below that, there would very often be officials level COBRAs, and you would then have either a permanent secretary or another senior official. A deputy national security advisor would be a good example. And it would run very effectively with whoever you needed to be there. So you'll try in advance to get the right kind of players around the table and to basically make sure that it was an opportunity for information exchange around particular issues. And very fulsome information exchange at that. You'd be looking at it, though, as a decision-making forum too. So from each meeting, you would expect there would be actions that would be going out to various departments to go and take away and do further things with. And sometimes the action was actually happening almost instantaneously in the room. And I'll come back to some of that in a second. But in advance of that, what would also happen would you'd run around the departments that were going to be there for whatever kind of event it was, and produce usually a document called a CRIP, a Common Reporting Information Picture, which would be literally a few sides of A4 that would be an agreed position on whatever the issue was. And obviously, depending on how sensitive it was, would depend whether that was a classified document or not. It didn't always need to be classified. Quite a lot of the issues that get dealt with in COBRA are civil emergency, civil contingency kind of things, which can be as simple as flooding or those kind of events which require a cross-departmental response and various input from various other people, but are not in and of themselves hugely sensitive. Obviously, at the other end of the scale, you deal with significant military interventions, sometimes with hostage rescue, for example. Then obviously there's much more sensitivity involved and a much more limited attendance in terms of who's in the room. And the room would vary enormously. So when we did the Olympics, for example, we had very, very regular COBRA meetings with all of the kind of key players for the Olympics going to be there, generally chaired by Jeremy Hunt, who was then the Cabinet Secretary for the Culture, Media and Sport Department, so obviously looking after the Olympics. But you'd have us there from a security point of view, from the military standpoint, but the police would be there, the transport guys would be there, the Olympic delivery guys would be there, London Organising Committee, Mayor of London, all those kind of people would always be in those meetings. So it was a very, very variable feast in terms of the way it actually ran. And that was one of its, I suppose, key advantages, was it was very, very flexible. It could could adapt to more or less whatever was required for the event at the time. And if it was an event that was running for any duration, then you'd expect there to be multiple meetings. The Olympics would be a very good example of that. We had a bunch of preparatory meetings, and then obviously immediately in advance of the games and during the games, we had very, very regular meetings, which as much as anything else were updates just to turn around and make sure everyone understood where the key pinch points were, where the issues were, who needed to think about the pain, if you like, on another department and what might that be bringing. So everyone would walk out of the meeting with a kind of common understanding of what the issue was. And as I say, often with some actions to go and pick up and take away as well. It was obviously a very secure space, so that was advantageous when you did need it to be tightly secure. It was physically security controlled, and inside the room itself was a typical secure environment. So no electronics were allowed in there, other than obviously the things that were part of the facility. So no mobile phones, no Bluetooth devices, anything like that. And that was, again, it was all about just making sure that the room was sanitized for when it needed to be sanitized and kept that way, so it operated in that kind of environment all of the time. The kind of content that you went through was really interesting, because some of the time it would be very informational for me, where you're sitting there and you're just listening to what's going on and having a better understanding, frankly, of some of the issues that were running in other departments for a particular issue. And often in the kind of world we all inhabited in that space, you're very focused on what you're doing. You're focused on your issues and your kind of departmental concerns, I suppose. So I was looking at stuff from a military point of view and what we were doing about it, where we could go further, where we perhaps were going to struggle to go further. And we didn't necessarily take a big look too often at what the impact would be on other departments. So COBRA was a place to actually bring that together. And you could walk out of the meeting having a much better understanding about why this was particularly difficult for the Home Office or the Foreign Office or whoever it happened to be on this particular day. And that was hugely, hugely illuminating. So it was one of these spaces where you learned a lot. You learned a lot about what else went on in government. And again, that was one of the reasons I found it such a fascinating place to be. And I mean, typically for some of the ones I went to, it was things like flooding in the UK. Quite regularly would end up with a military feature being around that. And we also had some strike stuff when I was there, and we had a tanker drivers strike, petrol tanker drivers strike, that was looking like it was going to create significant issues. So again, that's a classic where the officials level would get together, talk about what the potential art of the possible is, then decide what now needs to be escalated up to ministerial level, And then there may or may not be, and in that case there certainly was, a need for ministerial level COBRAs, which would then be the Prime Minister probably chairing it ordinarily, or a senior cabinet minister in his absence. So that would be a great example of that. The Olympics, as I've mentioned, very diverse, lots of different things going on over a lengthy period of time. The stuff that we more regularly saw, from my point of view, though, that was really interesting and often very, very challenging would be, as I mentioned already, hostage rescue, where a situation occurs, something happens overseas, generally in that instance, obviously, and you're looking at, right, what do we know? So the first thing is to turn around and get that common reporting information picture, the CRIP, sorted out, so we have a clear understanding from all source intelligence, usually in that instance pretty highly classified, often very highly classified, and you'd have a common picture that you could all work to. Everyone was walking into the meeting with the same set of information. However, you then sat down and you had a talk through about where you all were in terms of understanding. And often, because these situations move quite quickly, what was in the CRIP would already be slightly behind what was actually happening. And so therefore that information was vital. So if you're talking to the agencies, for example, or the Foreign Office in this kind of instance, you'd want to know what was happening on the ground. And to enable that, what we often did in those sort of situations was that's where you pulled in other people. So you'd actually have beamed into the meeting rather than physically in the meeting. Often, for example, if it was a hostage rescue situation in a foreign country, you'd have the embassy or the High Commission, and they would be on the line with everybody, potentially from ambassador, High Commissioner downwards, potentially being there to do that. You may well have, if you've got troops in situations, for example, special forces might well be on the line if it was that kind of scenario as well. So you'd have everybody that really needed to be there plugged in into the same conversation, with a clear opportunity to input their views, and then ultimately a decision process, which would be either official-led or ultimately prime ministerially led. And usually you would aim for this to be a process that would run pretty sequentially. So you'd start off building the picture up outside the meeting. You'd then go to the first meeting, have a clarification of understanding at officials level. Then almost certainly in a hostage rescue type situation, it is going to escalate and go up to higher levels. So it then becomes a prime ministerial level probably, and then you're doing this exactly the same. So they would go in with a CRIP, with an information document, and have the same kind of discussion, make sure they're all on the same page, and understand what actions can be taken. The decisions would be taken in the meeting, the actions would then be carried out outside the meeting, and the next meeting would pick up on where have we got to with all of those actions. Entirely logical. Obviously, it didn't always work like that. The age-old saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, was never truer in that kind of scenario. And one of my most memorable COBRA sessions was where I was in the meeting. Initially, it was being chaired by Ollie Robbins, who was at that stage one of the Deputy National Security Advisors, and it was around a hostage rescue situation. And we had all the normal players in the meeting, including the overseas element was on the line, and it was very evident that the timeline was moving much quicker than we were going to be able to generate further meetings. So we actually had what was called a collapsing timeline. Ultimately, we just had to make some decisions much, much more quickly. Ordinarily, of course, I would be responsible to the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, Military Strategy and Operations, my 3-star boss, and then ultimately to the Chief of Defence Staff above him. So that would be the kind of set of escalation steps. As it happened on this particular day, neither of them were there, nor were they actually available immediately to get there. So we literally ended up in a situation where it was obvious that stuff needed to happen much more quickly than had been previously expected. And Ollie Robbins ultimately broke the meeting up, took myself, the then Director of Special Forces, and a couple of other people, and we literally went across the, in the same building, moved across to Downing Street, which is directly linked to the Cabinet Office, and sat in the office with David Cameron as the Prime Minister to brief him on what had just been discussed in the meeting. It was a fascinating insight, and not my only one of these with his level, where you got a really clear view, politicians often, I think, get a really bad rap in this country and in many other countries as well for being indecisive and for flip-flapping around on different issues and all the rest of it. I have to say I was dead impressed with David Cameron on this day. He knew that he needed to make a decision, and that, frankly, only he could make the decision. And he knew that we needed clarity then and there. There was no further kind of time for prevarication, procrastination, etc. It needed to be done. So he went round the room, talked to each of us that were there, got a view from each of us, and then ultimately came down with the right decision is go. And so we launched the rescue mission, which was a big deal. It was a risky thing that we were asking people to go and do. We were definitely putting people's lives on the line, and he knew that, and was absolutely up for making the decision and taking the ownership of it, which I thought was a great piece of leadership, and it was good to see. And luckily, on this particular occasion, it all worked as planned. The Special Forces guys that were involved in the rescue did a fantastic job, and the hostages were rescued. Nobody was hurt on our side at all, which was really good news. So it doesn't always go like that. Of course, you can have some stuff which is definitely dealing with really difficult situations, and where you can again see some potential disasters coming down the road. We had another hostage rescue situation, which was very public. Actually, it was in the news. It was the Alaminas oil facility in Algeria, where a number of hostages were taken. And on that particular day, it just so happened that all of the key players in defense were not there. They were away. So the Secretary of State for Defense was away on an overseas trip. The Chief of Defence Staff was away, and my immediate boss, the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff, Bill Stratton Operations, was away. So you had literally had the Minister for the Armed Forces, the Vice Chief of Defence Staff, and me, and we were the three that were kind of all deputising up to do it. And again, that was a lovely part of that kind of role, that you were in a position where you genuinely were empowered. You felt, right, I am currently Director of Operations for the Ministry of Defence, because there's nobody else that's sitting there doing that. And you come out of those meetings having played a significant part in making some really quite crunchy decisions. Obviously, then feeding back up the chain to make sure everyone is as informed as possible immediately after it. But there's no messing around. There was no, right, okay, we can't make a decision yet because the big boss isn't around. It doesn't work like that. You have to get on with it, and you have to earn your pay, which was lovely. It was good to be in that kind of position. So the facility itself was great for that. And I think it's, as I say, it's often not really appreciated what goes on there, how it all works. There is clearly more I could say, I guess, but I'm probably best not doing too much more in terms of straying over any lines here that I don't want to talk about. But I think it's really, really good that the government has a setup like that can respond so quickly to pretty much any situation, be very, very adaptable in terms of the way it functions to pull things together, and it works. It really works. The only caveat to that is when you then cast the timeline forward a little bit, and I'm now out of the Air Force, but working for Deloitte, and in fact just left Deloitte and was working for them as a contractor when COVID hit. And of course, ordinarily you would expect the COBRA machinery would be the first place you would turn for that. But that was really interesting, because it was such a big problem that, yes, they did use the facility, and yes, they did have meetings there, and there were COBRA meetings that were going on. But the majority of that was actually dealt with in a different way, simply because every department was affected, every department was involved, and it needed a different kind of response. So again, credit to the British government in that sense, and the machinery around the government, that they were adaptable and flexible enough to be able to turn around and go, okay, this is a different problem. We can't just turn around and look at this in the same way we would with every other kind of problem. So we need to deal with it in a different way, and they did that, and it worked ultimately. I mean, obviously, the jury is out in terms of exactly what happened and the way that the processes worked, and some of the actions that were taken. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the apparatus around the decisions and the way that was actually run was, I think, highly effective, and did what it said on the tin, and was useful for all of those reasons. That's all I want to say about COBRA. because I think it's enough to give you a bit of a flavour of what it's like and what my aspect was, or my responsibility was in that role. And I hope it's been interesting for you. As ever, I really hope you do find these stories interesting and useful. If you do, please turn around and subscribe to YouTube if you're watching this. Follow or subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're on to make sure you get notification of the next kind of events. Share it, push it around, make sure other people are aware, because the more that you do that, the more that will help the podcast overall, and by extension help me, which is what I'm obviously keen you do. It does surprise me that 2.5 years in, and I know I've got lots of downloads, and I know lots of people follow it and watch and listen very regularly, that there are still lots and lots of people that clearly have not subscribed or followed. So please do. If you haven't already done that, please do that for me. That would be tremendously useful. I would also really appreciate you thinking very hard about the value piece, because these things, I think, do provide value for for lots of people. If it's giving you some genuine insight that you're finding helpful, just think about the fact, would I actually be prepared to pay for this in some way, shape or form? And if you are, then please think about supporting the podcast financially, because that will make a really big difference to me. And the subscription side of that is really, really small, but it makes a very big difference. So I'm looking at volume here. I want lots of people to turn around and give me a cup of coffee every month, and that will make a very big difference. So again, please think about that. If you're up for it, if you've got the resources available to you, I would be enormously appreciative of your help in moving that forward. Back next week with a thematic episode next week, I think, and then a guest the week after that, and some more guests in the pipeline downstream. So keep listening, keep watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. All the very best. Bye for now.